All right, so we just need to switch my slides over. I want to just say thank you all so much for having me, and many of the conversations with you all have been really wonderful, so thanks for all your hospitality, and it's been great to be with you. So now we're just going to watch as you make the change, because the big question I have for you this afternoon for us to explore is a big why question, and here it is. Why does it just feel so hard right now to be a pastor? Why does it just feel so hard? So I'm going to answer it right off the bat because that is a very existentially weighty question. And this is the reason. The answer is because of the secular. So thank you all very much. It has been really wonderful to be with you. Thank you. Yeah. Some of you are like more free time. That's what we're here for. So I get that. All right, here's the problem. Whenever you answer anything with the secular, you can connect to it. But it doesn't take very long till you realize that is an incredibly complicated word. What do we mean by that? And what I want to do with my time is try to unfold this word so that we can get a handle on what this means, because I think it's really important that we do. If we don't, I think some of our definitions of the secular and our best intentions of trying to solve issues that the secular may be imposing on us may actually make matters worse. Even out of our best intentions, we may end up making matters worse. So let's do this. Let's unfold this word for a bit. To do that, I have to take you a bit on a historical journey. I don't want you to think of this as just a historical journey. I want you to also think about the ways. We're talking about what it means to be in the world but not of the world. But we all are imaginative creatures. We all have certain imagination. So I want you to think about how culture imposes this kind of imagination on us. And it's nearly impossible to opt out of that. So this is a historical story, but it's also a story about how imagination gets shaped. So let's do this. Let's go back in time, and let's go back about 600 years. Let's go back 600 years. I asked for the DeLorean, the time machine, to be here so that we could do this together, but it wasn't available. So it wasn't in the budget, so we're just going to have to do this in our imaginations. So let's go back 600 years. Let's go somewhere exotic and cool. Let's go to Paris. Let's go to the streets of Paris in the 14th century. If we were in the streets of Paris in the 14th century, we would be in a society where there was no secular. There was no such thing as the secular. That the secular was set at zero. Now, of course, people knew the difference between what was sacred and what was profane. And by profane, I don't mean gross or bad. I simply mean not used in holy activity. So they knew the chalice the priest gave the Eucharist in was sacred. A shovel or a hoe in the field was profane. But for the most part, all of those things fit together. They were one whole cloth. Matter of fact, it was nearly impossible. It was very, very difficult to be an atheist in a secular zero world. It was very unusual. The whole society, the whole culture just continued to perpetuate and pass on belief. As a matter of fact, this is a statue that's in Venice, Italy. And I always ask groups of people, do you know who this is? And no one knows who it is because you would have to be a major statue nerd to know who this is. And if you are a statue nerd, let's not talk. Like, you just do your thing, find your group on Facebook. You seem like a very strange person, do your thing, but, I don't want to talk to you about it. But this is a statue in Venice, Italy, and it's a statue of a man named Paolo Sarpi. You can find this off the Grand Canal. You may not know the name Paolo Sarpi. What he is famous for is being Galileo's friend. He was Galileo's good friend, and he was the one who encouraged Galileo to write his book that got him in major hot water with the Catholic Church. Now, if you go and you find this statue, you will see there's a plaque underneath of it, and it will be in Italian. It will say Paolo Sarpi, date of birth, date of death. And then there'll be a quote in Italian, and you'll have to find a hunky Italian man to translate it for you, which if you need one, that's a great pickup line. And so this is what it says. The quote is fascinating. It says this. It says, Paolo Sarpi, the only unbeliever of his generation. That is fascinating. The only unbeliever of his generation. And we're talking the early 16th century. It was very hard, nearly impossible to not believe if you lived in a secular zero world. Now, I can't even imagine what it would be like to be a late modern person and go back to a secular zero world. I'm not even sure how to do that. I'm not sure I would want to do that, but I'm not even sure what that would look like. I only know of one thought experiment that's imagined what it would be like to be a modern person, particularly a late modern person, and go all the way back to secular zero. And it's a little dystopian show on Hulu called The Handmaid's Tale. I don't know if any of you have seen The Handmaid's Tale. If you haven't seen The Handmaid's Tale and you don't want to sleep tonight, just watch the first season of The Handmaid's Tale. But one of the shocking things about The Handmaid's Tale is it is this sense of a society going back to secular zero, and it becomes a nightmare. It becomes something incredibly frightening. If you don't know this TV show, you should watch it, but it's based off this novel and off a novelist and a book called The Handmaid's Tale by a Canadian author named Margaret Atwood. And what she explores is she imagines what would happen if America was taken over by a far-right group and they took America all the way back to secular zero. So America doesn't exist anymore, and now Gilead exists, which isn't quite true. If you know the show or the books, you know that America does exist, but it's a small enclave in Toronto. It's like Americans in diaspora. And I know this is supposed to be dystopian literature, but it's by a Canadian author. And honestly, that feels like Canadian fantasy to me. You know, have you ever talked to a Canadian? Have you ever talked to them? That's what they deep down long for. They would never admit it because they're so nice. But the thought that America exists in Toronto is it's the most luscious feeling they could ever imagine. But this group, Gilead, has taken over what once was America and taken them back to secular zero. And it really is a sense of that, where the liturgy, for instance, perpetuates every piece of life. So you watch this, the way you dress, the way you talk, all perpetuates belief, and you get punished if you don't do this. I mean, that's part of the plot of the show, that these women meet each other in the supermarket and they have to enact the liturgy. Under his eye, may the Lord open. And it's quite a frightening reality. Now, Atwood thinks it's a nightmare. It's an absolute nightmare to imagine you could be modern and go back to something like secular zero. And she thinks it's a nightmare. It's fodder for dystopia because you need three things to live in a secular zero world that I'm not quite so sure we have anymore. And the three things you need is you have to have a deep sense that the world is an enchanted place, that there are devils and there are demons everywhere, and they are moving within the world. You have to have a sense that things that you can touch and feel can be imbued with a divine force or an evil force. And if you get close to those things, yourself is so porous that those things can radiate into your being and affect the essence of your being for good or for evil. You have to have those three things to live in a secular zero world. There's a great book written by a Oxford historian named Keith Thomas, and he's written this book called Religion and the Decline of Magic. And in that book, he tells a very interesting story that happened in the 13th century in England. And they had a controversy that was going on. Biggest controversy that was capturing the anxiety of the clergy class during the 13th century is that they got intel that people were coming to the cathedral to take the Eucharist. It was being put on their tongue, and then they were leaving the cathedral without swallowing it. They were holding it in their mouth. They were leaving, they were going home, they were putting it on their fields, they were feeding it to their sick pig, not because they were denigrating it, because they believed it held power. That it was the thing itself, it was the very presence of Jesus Christ. And if you needed a good crop yield to survive the winter, put a little Jesus body on it. You need your pig to survive, feed Jesus to it. That it was a sense of veneration. But you can imagine bishops, priests, cardinals, very, very, very uncomfortable with this. So they called their annual gathering, and they got 300 pastors to show up like this. And the advertisement that went out was, this year we're going to discuss how to get people to swallow the host. And people were like, oh, I got to go to that. That sounds incredibly relevant. So they all came, and they were in a room, and some genius in the room came up with an idea as they're thinking, what are we going to do? Some genius rose his hand, they called on him, and he said, well, why don't we make people stick out their tongues? And this has been a practice that has held on. You've all seen an Irish or Italian gangster movie that all has a kind of Scorsese feel to it, and there's always a scene that is a montage of murders at the same time that mob boss's daughter is having first communion. So you get all the Scorsese symbolism of spilled blood, and it's montage back and forth, bodies falling, wine being poured, and you see it. Mob boss goes to the front of the railing, hands go behind back, tongue goes out, priest touches host, puts it on tongue, mob boss swallows it, and then like a 4-year-old with a sore throat at the doctor's office shows the priest it's been swallowed. It goes all the way back to the 13th century. Now, I have a son who I've told you is a freshman in college, and what I haven't told you about Owen is he's a beautiful person, and I want this on the record that he is a wonderful, wonderful boy. I would die for this kid. He is a wonderfully brilliant young man, but he's a pain in the butt. I mean, this kid is, especially when he was in high school, I mean, I could say the sky was blue and he would go on a long argument with me on how it's actually orange. Like, whatever I said, this kid was opposed to. Beautiful kid, but just major contrarian. So in our church in South Minneapolis, that my wife is the pastor of, when we take communion, we take it in a circle. We're a small enough congregation that we can all get up and we can take it in a circle. We have this beautiful moment where Cara gives the words of institution over the elements, and then the basket of bread is passed, the cup comes behind it, and we have this moment where we can turn to the person next to us, say their name, and give them the elements. It's one of the most beautiful moments we have in our worship experience. Well, one particular Sunday, my son, who's probably a sophomore in high school at this time, is standing next to me, and we're at about 6 o'clock in this circle, and the bread starts coming around counterclockwise, and he turns to me and he says, "Hey," in a kind of stage whisper, and he goes, "Hey, is that bread gluten-free bread?" And I know this is going to be a problem because this boy hates everything gluten-free. He can't stand gluten-free. He thinks it's disgusting. He thinks it's a scam by Big Bread or something. I mean, the kid hates gluten-free. And, of course, the reason the kid hates gluten-free is because, well, naturally, his mother's gluten-free. So, he just hates it. So it's coming around, and he asks me, "Hey, is that bread gluten-free?" And I know this is going to be a problem. So I say, without even looking at him, yeah, it's gluten-free. And this is what this kid does. He turns to me, and in a louder voice, he goes, "Well, then I'm out," and turns around and walks out of church. Now, this is a confession, people. This is a confession. So as the kids say, don't at me. But it took everything in me to not tackle the boy and beat him in front of the church that day. But think about that incredible different imagination of a medieval person going before the altar shaking on what would happen when this holy thing touched their sinful tongues, to my 15-year-old son at the time being like, I don't like the texture of gluten-free, and this will really annoy my mom, so I'm out. Very, very different kind of imagination. So when we think about a secular zero world, one of the primary ways that we could think of being a good pastor at this time, or what pastoral ministry was really about, was giving people access. Giving people access into the holy realm. Giving them access out of the demonic realm. That the pastor had the practices, had the things, the very relics that could take you in or out of these realms. Well, needless to say, we are no longer in a secular zero world. We never quite are as modern as we think we are, but that's a longer conversation for us. But this just sets up whatever the secular is, it comes out of this reality. The secular arrives in what we might want to call secular one. And the secular arrives when we take on a very new imagination, and that very new imagination is to have this deep sense that there is a divide between what is public and what is private. And particularly belief becomes a private thing. So think about it like this. Somebody in your life, an aunt, a grandmother, your mother, maybe your father, taught you that there were 4 topics that polite people do not talk about at a dinner party. I mean, there are 4 topics you should avoid. You remember these. Like the first one is that you should never ask people about how much money they make. Don't talk about money at a dinner party. It's very rude to meet someone tonight at dinner and be like, "Hey, just wanted to know, how much money do you make?" Like that is it's just not very polite. The second thing you weren't supposed to talk about, you remember, is politics. You weren't supposed to talk about politics. Now, that's nearly impossible in our day and age because politics is entertainment, so it's like, what else do you talk about but politics? But you were not supposed to talk about politics. The third thing has held on, I think, it's still with us, is that you're not supposed to talk about sex. It's very rude to ask someone about their sex life at a dinner party. And the fourth thing, what was the fourth thing you were not supposed to talk about? Religion. There it is. So there's the 4 of them: money, politics, sex, and religion. Why were those the 4 things you are not supposed to talk about? The reason is those 4 things are private. And polite people do not talk about private things in public. This is a major sea change. And it is what brings us into a secular age. Is when this arrives that we have the assumption that belief is more of a private thing. That when belief is a private reality, we enter into the dawn of the secular. That it doesn't really matter how the world is ordered per se. What matters is what's happening with you, what you believe, what you will to, what you will consent to. So we have a transition away from things and enchantment to wills being significant. It's not purely rational, but there's a sense of what will you hold to, what will you believe, what will matter to you. Now I want to show you a video clip that maybe illustrates this transition, importantly. And you remember this. It's hard to remember this because this happened before the pandemic. It's almost really difficult to remember anything that happened before the pandemic. But remember when we got word, maybe mid-morning for us here in North America, we got word that Notre Dame in Paris was on fire. Do you remember that? Yeah. Were you still there then? Yeah, it was burning. So I want to show you 30 seconds from the news that night, from the PBS NewsHour. So I'm giving you my PBS cred. I want you to know I'm not only a watcher, I'm also a supporter. So my tote bag is behind here. So this comes from the PBS NewsHour, and I want you to listen. They interview a woman, you probably know her, Scott. You'll see her title come up. She is the Dean of the Episcopal Chapel in Paris or something. And they interview her. And I'm not showing you this to be critical of her. This is exactly how I would answer. But it's a very different imagination. And it well should be. She's a modern person. But listen to how she talks about this.
Brought out in all of us how much we care, not just about the building, which is gorgeous and historic, but about what it stands for. Paris, France, Europe, the world, tradition, Christian faith at its finest. Christian faith that endures.
The Dean is grateful that so many relics survive.
The relics are important, whether or not it really was Jesus' crown of thorns, for instance. Who knows? What's important is that it was a focus of faith, a focus of people's prayers for hundreds of years. So the things themselves are not so important as what they stand for, what they mean to people, the faith they evoke.
At present, the precise...
All right, you hear it. It's almost as if I paid her to say that. And again, it is not to throw any shade on her. I think that this is exactly how I would answer if a camera was in front of my face, but you see a very different imagination. So, Jesus' crown of thorns. Is it really Jesus' crown of thorns? I mean, is it really, truly Jesus' crown of thorns? Well, in some sense, it doesn't matter, does it? It doesn't matter if it is or isn't. What matters is what it invoked in people, what it led people to pray, what it did kind of internally in people's willful movements inside their own being, what happened privately, somewhat in their own head, but at least in their own kind of sense of volition. That's what really matters. That is a big, big transition. This transition to the will really mattering. Now, this has a lot to do with Protestantism. I mean, Protestantism starts to bring this along. And to say that the will matters isn't to lower the bar of things, it's actually to heighten it. For Protestants, particularly Reformed Protestants, it became very important now after the Reformation that every second of every day you willfully act to live faithfully before God. This is what the priesthood of all believers meant. My Lutheran students, love the priesthood of all believers because they think it means some kind of doing away with hierarchy and everyone kind of living their own life. That's not what it means. It all means we live at priests now. We all live the burden of having to pray, having to read the text, that we have to bend our lives towards obedience every second of every day. And we know this about Puritan women who came to this country. They kept time journals where they reviewed every second of every day and if it was done before God. And if you sat in Jonathan Edwards' church, he would remind you that every second of every day you need to will it towards God, that you live before God, and will you be faithful with that, and not only with your own, but with your children? Will they live their lives in a way before God? So I grew up in a conservative Lutheran denomination, and I remember one sermon from growing up, which is sad. One sermon I remember from growing up, because I was a nerdy church kid, so I should remember more, but I remember one sermon. And it was the one time my Lutheran pastor preached his Jonathan Edwards sermon. He never preached another, but he preached one Jonathan Edwards sermon. And this is how it went, and I will never forget it. I was seated in the back of the church, and this was his refrain from his sermon. He said, if you waste time, you steal from God. If you waste time, you steal from God. Something Jonathan Edwards could have preached. And I remember sitting in the back and running over the phrase in my head over and over again. If you waste time, you steal from God. If you waste time, you steal from God. And then I thought to myself, my gosh, I'm in 5th grade. And then I thought, I go to a school that starts at 8:30 and goes to 3:30. I hate school. I hate everything about school. These 6 years of being in school, I have honed my skills of time wasting. I have become a time wasting savant. I hide magazines, I daydream, I draw pictures. I couldn't believe it. But that was his one Jonathan Edwards sermon. He never preached another. But this is the point. Now we all have to live at this high bar. Now it also happens that, especially in the 19th century, people can start wondering why. Why should we live at that high bar? But the objective here is to live at this high bar. What it does for us is this also becomes the time of the modern denomination that we all in this room live within, the modern denomination. And one of the realities of the modern denomination is internally the modern denomination knows it can only exist for one more generation. Now let me be clear about that. The modern denomination, say the Peace USA or the ELCA, I'm not saying it will only exist for one more generation. I'm saying it knows that if the next generation does not renew their commitment to the modern denomination, it will not exist. So if the next generation does not decide to be Peace USA, there will be no Peace USA structure. If the next generation does not decide to be ELCA, there will be no ELCA denomination. You need the next denomination to willfully consent to enact their lives inside of that structure, or it won't exist. This is why the Peace USA and the ELCA, the two denominations I know best, both have every 3-year youth gatherings, the triennium. And the ELCA, they creatively call it the youth gathering. And so they gather every 3 years, just as we were saying. And I tend to go to this thing, and it's always, for the Lutherans, it is a major, major pep rally. It's a pep rally of being Lutheran. It's usually in some, basketball stadium with 20,000 people, and it's a big deal. And I was at one a few years ago in San Antonio, and I didn't mean for this to happen, but I happened to be creepy middle-aged guy listening to high school girls talk. I didn't mean to be, but I was walking into the convention center and I was trying to get past these girls, but I couldn't, so I had to kind of stand behind them, so I was overhearing what they were talking about. And they looked like they were maybe 10th grade, and in my memory, they were from California. I'm not sure they were really from California, but it's more fun to tell the story if they're from California. So they're walking in front of me, and these two girls, and it was day 3 or 4 of this thing, and it was, a great time. These girls were just loving it, and they were walking, and they were, just fooling around with each other. And one of the girls kicked her friend in a kind of playful way, like you're standing next to the person and you do this thing, like where did it come from? But the girl got kicked immediately, knew that her friend kicked her, and she played it up, and it was all just banter of friendship. And the girl that got kicked turned to her friend. This is where it's more fun if they're from California. Turned to her friend and goes, "Oh my gosh, I can't just believe you just kicked me." And I'm listening to this, waiting to get past these girls. But then she says this, she goes, "I can't believe you just kicked me. That is such an un-Lutheran thing to do." And it stopped me in my tracks. And I kept thinking about, un-Lutheran? An un-Lutheran thing. She got kicked and she didn't say, "That's a very unethical thing to do," or "That's a very unbiblical thing to do." She said, "That's a very un-Lutheran thing to do." Now I thought to myself, if the friend who kicked her would have put her arm around her and said, "Hey, we're hearing all this stuff about justification by faith alone, but I want you to know your works really matter," that people would have been very un-Lutheran. That would have been a very, very un-Lutheran thing to do. But kicking your friend wasn't un-Lutheran, but she got exactly why the denomination was pouring millions of dollars into this event. She was trying on, at least for 4 days, what it would mean to willfully consent to be a Lutheran. Would it last 4 weeks, or 4 years, or till she's 44? Probably not, maybe not, but it's worth the investment, because if the next generation does not willfully consent to enact their lives this way, there's nothing else that will keep this going. No medieval priest would have ever imagined that you could say, if people in the village don't care, then we're all screwed here, folks. If we don't mark it well, then they're never going to come. They couldn't imagine that was even possible. But now here we are, and we do know this, that if we don't willfully consent, then what happens? It all disappears. The second element here is we move from living in a cosmos to living in a universe. Remember when this happened? And I probably need a better example now, but now that we've had a full eclipse. But remember when January 31st, 2018 happened? This was when there was a super red blood moon. Now this happened before the pandemic too, but a lot of you remember this, and maybe this was all a kind of rerun or forerunner into what just happened for those of you who saw part of an eclipse or a full eclipse. You remember, because maybe you remember this time that you were so busy. If you're a congregational pastor, you'd never done more pastoral care visits than 2 weeks before this and 2 weeks after. Remember this? All right, I can't play this up too much, but it is fun in rooms of pastors to act like that and watch you all look at each other like, I wasn't busy. Were you busy? I don't remember this at all. None of you were busy. None of you were busy during the eclipse or during the super red blood moon. But you could imagine a world where you were, where people were calling and saying, Pastor, I just interviewed for a job, and I think I might take it in Chicago, but I'm not sure if I should now because I heard there's this super red blood moon. Is it safe to take this job? Or, Pastor, we've been trying to have a baby, but now there's a super red blood moon. Should we continue or should we stop? What is going on here? When you live in a cosmos, the idea is even the natural phenomenon speaks, that there's a message even in the natural phenomenon. But when you live in a universe, the natural phenomena is still natural phenomena, but doesn't have a message. It doesn't mean anything. We know when the next one of these is going to come. We have mathematical equations for that to occur. And you see what happens to the pastor there. That before the pastor, the priest, the spiritual leader was even interpreting natural phenomenon for its message. There's something here God has to tell us. Now, no one asked you what it means that there was an eclipse. No one assumed there was some big story at play in it. And maybe that's good, maybe that's bad. But what it does show us is whatever belief is, it becomes even more internal. That even the natural phenomenon has no message in it. It's all what kind of happens inside of you. So this transitions us from being about access to being about demonstrate. That the pastor becomes one who helps people demonstrate. For instance, you help people demonstrate publicly what is true privately. That becomes the important piece of what the pastor does in a secular one reality. You as the pastor are a public person who somehow has to preach sermons, lead Bible studies that go over the line of a public word into people's private constitution and get them to think in a different way or claim different things or believe different things. And there is a bit of vampire phenomena here. You know how vampires work? Remember when vampires were everything on pop culture? It was a vampire show after vampire show. And part of vampire phenomena is that a vampire actually is not allowed to cross the threshold of your house unless they are invited into it. And once you invite them in, then they can eat you. But you have to first invite them over the threshold. This happens for the pastor when we enter into a secular one world. That people, that's their private lives. They don't want you in it unless you invite them in. If you go up to someone after church and say, you know what, I just have been noticing that the way you're raising your 14-year-old is not a very holy way to raise them. They will say, excuse me, Pastor, thank you, but we have not invited you to give us advice on how to raise our 14-year-old. If we're in crisis, we may ask you to help us. We may invite you into the threshold, past the threshold into our private lives, but stay in the public realm, and we'll take what we can to impact our private reality. That's a very different challenge when you are a public person having to cross the threshold. Now this transitions, and it moves us into what I think we would probably, if we were here kind of taking a test on what we think the secular is, I think most of us would have given a secular 2 definition. When the media talks about the secular, it almost always references secular 2. So if secular 1 is when belief becomes private, and what our public lives are shaped at doesn't necessarily need to be bound in belief, then what is secular 2? Well, secular 2 is that fewer and fewer people are going to church. Secular 2 is the kind of classic definition of the secular, that our religious institutions and people's own kind of participation in religious institutions is in decline. So we are in a secular age, we tend to assume, because there are fewer people going to church. We are in a secular age because some of our churches are being turned into high-end lofts in urban areas and into microbreweries. That these are all signs of the secular. That the sense of the secular is that we are losing ground. That a religious space seems to be growing and religious space seems to be shrinking. We tend to think that this is what it means to live in a secular age. So I have a former student who's a friend of mine who's a pastor at a pretty big church in the Twin Cities, and he told me he did a terrible thing, a thing that I would really recommend that you never do. It was a major failure on his part. What he did is he Googled his church. Don't ever Google your church. He did the worst thing. He Googled his church, and he saw that his church had 8 Google reviews. It had 8 Google reviews. I don't know if you know this, but you can basically Google review anything. I think if you wanted to right now, you could go online and Google review this front pew. See 5 stars. You can Google review just about anything. So he saw that his church had 8 Google reviews, and he did the worst thing. He read those Google reviews. Don't ever do that. But he thought he could because he had like 4.8 stars out of 5. And he thought, I could use some affirmation today, so I'll read these. So he's reading through these Google reviews, and they all are really positive. Like the first one says, "We love this church. The carpets are always clean at this church. We love it. This church is great," the next one said. "They are committed to clean nursery toys. They sanitize their toys once a quarter. We love this church," the third one said. "The preaching is worth our 45-minute drive. It sometimes makes us laugh." And on they went. And when he got to about the 4th or 5th one, he said he had this sinking feeling of dread because he realized they were all written in the very same format as an Airbnb review. They were all about the amenities, what you get out of being part of it. And this becomes part of the trap if we define the secular as the loss of participation. If we see it as the loss of people coming, then the best pastoral ministry, the best congregations are able to win back people's participation. It becomes a very different form of what we think ministry is. That we become quite obsessed with how do we get more and more people to participate, because our existential crisis is fewer and fewer people are coming. So it moves forward from demonstrate to participate. That the best pastor, the best minister is winning more and more participation. Now let me be really clear on this. This is an issue. Anyone who oversees a budget in a church or is someone like me who works in a denominational seminary, this is a huge issue. We are very aware in our seminary that we lose another 10, 15% of membership across the denomination. Well, they don't need 7 seminaries right now. Why would they need all the rest of these? And most churches in this country, and most churches across the main line, are one roof leak away from being over. One roof leak, and they will never recover financially from this. So we should not be flippant about this, and many of you feel the pinch of this. Fewer participation means how do you keep the lights on? How do you deal with these buildings that have been gifted to us that we have to steward? It's important. Human bodies always need buildings to be in, or they always need places to be. And we have to think really deeply about what it means to steward these, care about them. This is all really an issue. So we should never be flippant about it. However, I'm not sure what it actually means to live in a secular age is secular too. I don't think what it means to live in a secular age is that fewer and fewer people are going to church. I think what it means to live in a secular age is what we'll call secular 3. All right, now I have your mind spinning, and it is late in this conference, and a break is coming, a free time, and now you're getting really, really tired because I have all these seculars at play. So just as a way of review, secular 1 is when belief becomes a private reality. And secular 2 is the weakening of institutions. It's fewer and fewer people are going to church. Then what is secular 3? This is what secular 3 is. Secular 3 is when all belief, we should underline that, all belief becomes contested. Or another way of saying this, which I find a little bit more provocative, it's when all belief becomes fragilized. When all belief becomes fragile or fragilized. So this is the conditions in which we live in our time, is that we are very, very aware, whether we're explicit about it or not, we're very aware that we could believe something very differently. Or we know that people who live across the street don't believe at all, or believe something very differently than us, and they seem to be doing okay. I mean, they go to all their kids' soccer games, and when the garbage man comes, they get their cans in like on Tuesday. It takes you till Friday. Like we know we could be living a very different way, that we live with this deep sense of the fragilization of our own belief. So when it comes to this fragilization in secular 3, there's both a positive and a negative dynamic to that. But I don't want you to hear that pejoratively, like there's a good thing and there's a bad thing. I want you to think of it like a battery. There's a plus and there's a minus, and you have to have the plus and the minus lined up correctly to get the thing to operate, and that's all I know about it. Electrical engineering right there. That's it. But this is how secular 3 works. The negative reality of living in secular 3 is that transcendence as an overall meaning system, or a sense that there is a living God who moves within history, simply becomes more and more unbelievable to people. And not even as a logical resistance to something, not even as a weighing of the evidence and deciding against it. They just simply don't think about it. I mean, the fact that it is a very logical thing that people say all across our cultural context, things like, well, you know, Pastor, I just feel like I need to take a break from God for a while. I'm just going to take a break from God for a while. Or you can even have pastors who will say things like, if I'm really, really honest, I haven't thought about God in months. I mean, I've preached a sermon every week, but really thought about God? Nah, not in a long time. If you inherit that kind of culture, that kind of world, that's very different than anything that's come before it. That God becomes quite an option. So it isn't even a direct logical rejection. It's just the sense that there is a living God who moves and is moving history, just becomes more unbelievable to people. It's hard for them to hold on to. That's the negative reality. The positive reality is that people who inhabit this secular 3 space deeply, deeply long for meaning. They are out looking for meaning. So this becomes a very strange kind of secular world, because in this kind of secular world, what happens is it creates a surplus of spiritualities. Everyone is spiritual, and they need a spirituality because they need to construct meaning for themselves. And they could use a little kind of spirituality to help them with that. They could use a little spirituality to help them with the road rash of all the competition of all the kind of performances of their self. So this is a weird kind of secular age, because when we think secular, we often think without spirituality or without the mystical, and yet this creates all sorts of conditions for all sorts of what we might call third-way spiritualities. So people will say, well, you go to church, that works for you, that's great, but I just, every Sunday I take my dog on a walk by a lake, and that does it for me. Or what works for you is this kind of classic Christian practice. What works for me is just, hot yoga is what does it for me. Or CrossFit does it for me. All these third-way spiritualities start to hold significant weight to help people find meaning. Now, I'm building all of this off and synthesizing for you the work of the Canadian philosopher Charles Taylor. And Charles Taylor has written a 770-page book called A Secular Age. It is a perfect book to keep your door open on a very windy day. It will keep it open perfectly. The crazy thing about the book, 770 pages, he only wants to answer one question. One question, 770 pages. And not only does he want to answer one question, he only wants to answer one question for one part of the world. So he's interested in answering a question for just what he calls the leftovers of Latin Christendom. So in other words, those of us in the western part of the world, Western Europe, North and South America, those who've come out of Latin Christendom. He's interested in these kind of societies. And the one question he has is basically what I've led you through here, is why is it in these Western societies that in 1500, if we just use big round numbers, in 1500, it was nearly impossible to live in one of these societies and not believe in God. It's nearly impossible. In a short 500 years later, stopping at big round numbers again, the year 2000, it's completely flipped. And across the West, it's much easier to not believe in God than to believe in God. What's happened? And that's particularly true, maybe not in America, but it's particularly true in France. Very true in the Scandinavian countries. For the most part, pretty true in the UK. Much easier to not believe in God than to believe in God. He says, what has happened here? So 770 pages just to answer that one question. And it is a zigzag kind of discussion. And the thing that will make you very nauseous is you pretty much have to read it at least 3 times to really get what's going on. So That makes you very, very uneasy. But one of the reasons some of us continue to read it over and over and over again is he says things like this that I think is really quite fascinating. He says this kind of fragilization that we have, he says it's a two-way fragilization. It's a two-way fragilization. So it works like this. If you're someone who believes, he thinks, which he would count himself, a very committed Catholic, takes the Eucharist every week. He said, if you're someone like me, if you're someone like us in this room, you can't help it. You can't help it. In the context of this kind of secular age, you will find your belief fragilized. You're going to have moments where you think to yourself, is this true? Or is this just the family I grew up in? I mean, if I would have grown up in another family, another part of the world, would I believe this? Yeah, no, I believe it. And you go on, and then you get fragilized again. And you think, ugh, religion, is it true? Or is this just an evolutionary trick? I mean, is this just false pattern recognition writ large? Is that all this is? No, I believe it. His point is you can't help it. Living in the context of this secular age, you are going to have moments where your belief becomes fragilized. You preach to people who are going to have moments of fragilization. That this is just the context in which we live. However, what's fascinating is he says it works the other way as well. Let's say you're a young adult. Let's say you live somewhere hip and cool, like Brooklyn or Austin, Texas or something. You've been educated at an elite university, and you've read a lot, and now you're working on your band while you're working on an app, and you're on all these websites, and you're really well educated, and you're in all these discussions. And again, you've been to an elite university, and you know what religion is. I mean, come on. You know what it is. Let's just face it. All religion is a historical reality used by powerful people to keep other people down. That's what you believe. What you believe is that you don't believe. That's your belief system. And when you die, you go to heaven. Come on, people. Grow up. When you die, it's like a TV set that's on. It gets unplugged. It just goes blank. That's what happens when you die. That's what you believe, again, is that you don't believe. Taylor's point is you too will have a moment where your belief system of unbelief will be fragilized, and you will have moments of believing. So, for instance, your sister says to you, you have to come and hear your nephew's Christmas concert. You don't want to go. Come on, you don't want to go. But you also don't want her nagging you. So you go and you sit in the back of this concert hall, and you're just there to appease your sister. And then it starts. Bum, 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 bum. It's a Bach recital. And all of a sudden you get washed over by that music. And you have a moment where your unbelief is fragilized and you feel like there's something bigger. You feel like there's something reaching for you. Or we know when empirically people have their first child. And they think there's no meaning in the universe. You know how big the universe is? There's no meaning here. We've all just constructed this meaning here, people. We are just a teeny piece of carbon in a very insignificant solar system, off on the side of a certain galaxy. There's no meaning here. Grow up. There's absolutely no meaning here. And then you pick that baby up for the first time. And you feel something reach for you. And it's more than her little finger. You feel like you've known her forever, that there's something that connects you. Or at potential of being self-indulgent, one more, you get word that your mother's died. You knew she was sick, but she died very quickly and you couldn't be there. So you make arrangements, you fly home, you'll stay with your cousin, you'll be there for the funeral, for the burial, and then you'll fly back the next morning. Very sad experience. You knew she was going to die, but losing a parent is just so hard. Well, after the funeral and after the internment, you end up at your cousin's house, and your siblings are there, and a few of your cousins, and you spend late up talking and drinking and remembering your mother and telling stories. And your brother tells a story about how, remember when Mom used to clean the kitchen? She'd always put on this 80s song, and she'd sweep and do this little dance, and that makes you all cry and laugh and cry some more. Well, you go to bed. Like I said, maybe you had a drink or two too much. You go to bed, you sleep past your alarm. You have an early morning flight. You get up, you realize that you've got to race to the airport, you get all your clothes in your suitcase, you go out to your rental car, you start your rental car, you back up, the radio's been left on. And there it is. That same 80s song is on the radio. And you have a choice. You can think to yourself, oh my gosh, Jeffrey Bezos is listening to everything we say. Unplug the Alexa now. Or you can wonder, is there something bigger? Is there something out there? His point is, this is the world you live in. And there's no real freedom from being caught between those. This is what he calls cross pressure. We're always being crossed up. And what you do as a pastor is walk with people in cross pressure. Sometimes they believe and find themselves in doubt, and you walk with them. And sometimes you walk with people who don't believe, who have moments of believing and want to talk to you about it, want you to help them interrogate those experiences, search into those experiences. There's great possibility open to us here. But regardless, inside of whether we are someone who believes and finds ourselves fragilized or someone who doesn't believe and finds ourselves in moments of believing, we nevertheless minister to people, and we ourselves are people who live inside of an immanent frame. Our frame is an immanent one. So Charles Taylor says this, if you can read this. He says, the immanent frame is a constructed social space that frames our lives entirely within a natural rather than a supernatural order. It is a circumscribed space of the modern social imaginary that precludes transcendence. Oh my gosh, that's a lot. Like, that makes you really, really tired. So what Taylor means here is that we all have a framework. We all have default settings. We get them from the institutions we live in. It's just the way we're educated, we get those. For someone in a secular zero world, their default mechanisms, the frame in which they see the world, is more of a supernatural one than a natural one. We, however, are the opposite. We presume more natural material answers than supernatural answers. Now, that's a lot for a philosopher. To help this make sense, I need lyrics from a pop star. Now, that makes me seem very, very cool. Except I'm going to show you lyrics from a song that's like 12 years old. But don't pay attention to that. Just think I'm cool. That will make me feel good about myself. I want to show you lyrics from the British pop star Lily Allen. Do people know the British pop star Lily Allen? This is maybe the most controversial thing that I could say, and particularly controversial in Nashville. But Lily Allen is who Katy Perry is trying to be. See, that's very controversial if you're a Katy Perry fan. But I did not say Taylor Swift, so you have no license to hurt me. If I would have, if you insult Tay-Tay, then you can be murdered. And I didn't do that. All right, so here's Lily Allen, a lyric. Again, ignore that this is 10 years old. But she says this. She says, life's about film stars and less about mothers, but it doesn't matter because I'm packing plastic, and that's what makes my life so effing fantastic. Okay, people? First of all, I think it's very dangerous to ever exegete a pop star's lyrics. So I have to admit to you, I have no idea what this means. No idea in any way what this means. I have no idea what packing plastic means. It probably means she has a credit card with a major credit limit on it. More than likely, it means she's had one part of her body surgically enhanced. But nevertheless, that becomes the measure of the good life. So you get the vibe of this. It's very irreverent. It's very kind of in your face. It's very kind of poppy middle finger wagging in your face. This is the lyric I want you to see. She says, now I'm a weapon of massive consumption. It's not my fault. It's how I'm programmed to function. Now here it is. Now I'm not a saint, but I'm not a sinner. Now everything's cool as long as I'm getting thinner. Now I'm not a saint, and I'm not a sinner. Now everything's cool as long as I'm getting thinner. That is the immanent frame. Think about it like this. For most of Western history, for most of the traditions we all inherit, it was a pretty darn big deal. It kept people up at night. Are they a saint or are they a sinner? Are they bound for heaven or are they bound for hell? What does God think of them? I mean, my goodness, Martin Luther could not sleep when he went in the Erfurt Monastery, wondering, does God think of him as a saint or as a sinner? Does God think of him as good or bad? What does God think of him? He couldn't sleep. He once went to Stupitz, his confessor, and confessed for 6 straight hours. 6 straight hours. People, that's like 2 Lord of the Ring movies. Like, that's a long, 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 long time. And then Luther, the story goes, that he left the confessional after 6 hours, thought to himself, my gosh, I feel unburdened by this confession. And then went, oh, wait, maybe it's wrong to feel unburdened by this, and went back and tried to start all over again. And his confessor's like, no, Marty, you have to actually go do something before you can come back here. But couldn't sleep. And Luther had one of his most beautiful constructive theological works when he said, reading Romans, he realized it's not really an either or. It is both and. It's his simile, as he said it. You are simultaneously both saint or sinner. That theological move was an incredible balm to Northern Europeans for 500 years, all the way up into 2012 in this British pop star. All right, we're not going to give her that much credit, but she signals something. She essentially says, I have never once woke up in the middle of the night in a cold sweat wondering what God thinks of me. Not once have I wondered Am I a saint or am I a sinner? I have never, ever lost 1 minute of sleep worrying about that. But what's fascinating is she's lost a lot of sleep. She has woke up many times overwhelmed with anxiety, burdened by deep existential tremors. It's just their source is not a transcendent reality. It is not God's law that she has broken. It is herself. Swimsuit season's coming. What are people going to think of me? See, there's a certain perspective that happened, particularly around the Enlightenment and around the French Enlightenment. Voltaire said this all the time, that if we could get these overweening priests out of our life, we would never feel guilty again. We never have to feel guilty. It's these priests that make us feel guilty. And yet, if you spend any time in upwardly mobile middle-class settings, you know people feel impinged by incredible forms of guilt all the time. It's just what they feel guilty to is not God. They feel guilty to themselves. They let themselves down. They could have done more. They could have actually started the business. They could have started working out. They could have watched what they eat. They could have finished the degree. They could have started the podcast or that other podcast or maybe that third podcast or maybe that other podcast. Everyone has a podcast. They could have done this, but they didn't, and they failed themselves. So you see the difference between an immanent frame and a more transcendent frame. And we get this. Taylor says, we can't help looking over our shoulders from time to time, looking sideways, living our faith in a condition of doubt and uncertainty. And even Lily Allen has this. So in the verses we get, I'm a weapon of massive consumption. It's not my fault. That's how I'm programmed to function. But then in the chorus, we get a deep probing where she says, I don't know what's right or what's real anymore. I don't know how I'm meant to feel anymore. When do you think it all becomes clear? Because I'm being overtaken by the fear. You see this cross pressure in the midst of this. Now, what I should do as we start to move this towards conclusion is I should play this song for you, right? That'd be too obvious, so I'm not going to play this song for you. But I do want to play a song for you. It's about 3 minutes long. And it makes me feel a little cooler because it comes from an independent band called Purple Mountains. And if you want to be cool, you just mention an independent band that no one else has ever heard of. And then you are super cool, right? So this is a song by a band. I actually didn't find this after making fun of Canadians. A Canadian guy found this and showed this to me. He says, I think this illustrates your point. And it does, beautifully. So the band's called Purple Mountains, and the song is called Margaritas at the Mall. Now what I want you to do as you listen to this, you'll see the lyrics come up, is I want you to just grab hold of what lyric kind of catches your attention. 2 things you need to know as you listen to it is, one, the songwriter and performer of this song in no way has ever spent 1 minute in a church. Not one. Not a youth group kid who now is looking back after not being in church and longing for it. This is a person who's never spent 1 minute in a church. This is someone in a secular 3 reality who has, their belief system is that they don't believe. And yet he has some deep probing questions he asks here. Second thing you need to know, and I just need to apologize for this song is incredibly catchy. So, like 3 weeks from now, you are going to be humming Margaritas at the Mall. If you are of age to use the bathroom in the middle of the night, you are going to be walking back from the bathroom humming Margaritas at the Mall, and you are going to curse my name. But what I want you to do when that happens, when it gets stuck in your head, and you can't get Margaritas at the Mall out of your head, is I want you to stop, and I want you to pray. And I want you to say, God, are you telling me now to go onto Amazon and buy an Andy Root book? Okay, I'm kidding. That was just a complete consumer joke, but I had you all eating out of my hand there. All right, so this is Margaritas at the Mall. Sound folks, we're going to need to pump the volume a bit on this. What lyric jumps out to you? the margarita carts are supposed to come out right now. You guys didn't get my email that the margarita carts are supposed to come out right now? All right. What lyric jumps out to you? Trotting the sod of the visible with no new word from God. How long can the world go on under such a subtle God? Now, really, the whole point of Charles Taylor's 700 pages is to tell us a story of how the West didn't eliminate God. You do phone interviews, sociologists will tell you most people across the West, even in France and Germany and Scandinavian countries, will report they believe in God. But God has become subtle. God has become a subtle God. The great, quote-unquote, accomplishment of the West is to make God quite a subtle reality. How long can the world go on, he wonders, though, under such a subtle God? What do you get in replace? What do you get that replaces the subtleness? Well, you get something. You get margaritas. You get a mall. And this young man wonders, is that enough? Is that enough? Does that actually give the human spirit the depth it needs to live? And he's not sure. And actually, he answered in a very tragic way that it isn't possible. You don't have to talk to too many people where they will say things, especially you can see this online, where they'll remind us that belief has consequences. Hence, so many of our religious institutions have hurt people. That belief has consequences. But David Berman, who wrote this song, shows us that unbelief has its consequences too. Right during the pandemic, David Berman actually killed himself. That there was just no meaning here. There wasn't enough. That we inherit a world where God becomes quite subtle. And that's an accomplishment in some ways. I mean, in some ways, I'm glad I don't go to church at Jonathan Edwards Church. You know, like to be told every second of every day. But what do you get in its place? There's not much here other than margaritas. Now, as we land the plane here for our day, I can't tell you how many people who are deeply worried about the church, really worried about what will happen in the next 10, 15 years, essentially say to me, you know what will save us? You know what we need? We need margaritas. Get a margarita machine at your church. Okay, no one has ever said, I need a margarita machine at their church, because that would be kind of cool. But I can't tell you how many people have said, well, you know, the issue is, if we just had better coffee, that would do it. If we could just market in a way, then they would come. Remember I told you at the beginning that out of our best intentions, we may make matters worse? to be concerned to even make our churches. My goodness, Protestantism in the late 20th century did this explicitly, turned our churches into malls to attract people. The problem with that, out of the best intentions, was to foreclose people further in the immanent frame. That you actually perpetuate a closed immanent frame when you essentially say what it means to worship together is it should feel like a mall. It should be like having margaritas. But in a deeply secular 3H, people are deeply yearning for meaning. And the challenge for you isn't to win participation, but how will you witness to them in the midst of their doubts that God still acts and God still moves? So let me end by telling you one story that maybe gives you a picture of what this might look like. So a few years ago, I was doing a research on a book, a very kind of nerdy academic monograph book, but I read a book by the anthropologist Tanya Lerman. T.M. Lerman is what she writes under. Some of you, I'm sure, have read this book called When God Talks Back. Now, what Lerman does, just quickly, is that she's interested in another divide amongst all the divides we have in our culture. And there's a divide that no one's really talked about, that there are a group of people, it's a small group of people, but there's a group of people nevertheless, who talk quite easily about God speaking to them. God speaks to them often. And then we have a larger group of people who find anyone who says God talks to them very suspect and maybe out of their minds. They don't trust those people, and those people share cubicle walls, and yet, here they are. So she wanted to explore the people who said God spoke to them. So as a good anthropologist, she joined a Vineyard church in the Chicago area. Spent 3 years in the Vineyard church, then moved to Northern California, spent another 3 years in another Vineyard church, 6 years worshiping with these people, living with them. She ends her book in the most beautiful way. She says, she's a psychological anthropologist, so she says, can we say that people who say God speaks to them, that this is just really low-grade schizophrenia, that that's what's happening here? Her answer is, you can't say that. There's no correlation in any way to any kind of mental illness of people who hear God speak to them. Now she says, can we then say that they are hearing God speak to them? She says, well, you don't get tenure at Stanford for saying that God speaks to people, so I'm not going to say that. But then she says something utterly beautiful. She says, what I can tell you is during my time living in these communities, my father died. And these people walked me through. These people prayed for me, and it changed my life. It's profound. But I thought, what would happen if you went to a couple mainline churches and asked people if they've ever heard God speak to them? I mean, if you're in a Vineyard church or in a larger Pentecostal church, you get patted on the back for saying God spoke to you. You go to a Lutheran or Presbyterian church and say God spoke to you, and people don't pat your back. They step back. They think that this is really strange. So I did this thing called life history interviewing, where you just write 6 big questions. You have a kind of hour-long conversation. You record it with their permission. You look for themes. So I asked all these people. It's just 12 people. Point is, this is not like a conclusive national study. But of these 12 people, I asked them, have you ever had an experience where God spoke to you? All 12 of these people said they had. They had had an experience. I had one man in his 70s who said, oh, I hate it. When anyone ever says God speaks to them, I know they're manipulating me. I would never trust anyone who says God speaks to them. Absolutely not. And he said, except one time. And then he told his one-time story. Everyone had at least a one-time story. And then I said to them, have you ever told anyone this story at your church? Never. I said, well, clearly you've told your pastor because your pastor nominated you to talk to me. Have you ever told your pastor this story? Never told their pastor this story. Folks, how long can the world go on under such a subtle God? God isn't subtle. God is moving in these people's lives. And yet there isn't space for them to make these assertions, to wrestle with these experiences. But what I want to end with is the final interview I did. It was with a young woman. Her name was Rachel. She was the youngest person in my sample. She was probably 35. She came into her pastor's office to talk to me, and she looked like she wanted to be anywhere, and she wanted to get this conversation over as quickly as she could. She was doing this because her pastor asked her to, but she just wanted it to be over. She kept on saying to me, I'm really busy, I'm a single mom, I'm really busy, I'm a single mom. Every question I had, 2-3 sentences, let's move on. She wasn't doing this, but she basically was doing this. I was out of questions, and I had about 10 more minutes, so I just decided to freelance one question. So I said to her, Rachel, have you ever had an experience where you felt so deeply ministered to that you felt like it was the very presence of Jesus Christ? And her whole disposition changed, and she says, I have. She says, I've never told anyone this story. She says, throughout our conversation here, I've been telling you I'm a single mom, but I've never told you why I'm a single mom. She says, I'm a single mom because 4.5 years ago, my husband got on a plane and he flew from Seattle to Chicago, and he was supposed to be gone for 3 days. He was gone for just over 13 hours, and I got a phone call. And on the other line was a very awkward young man, and he said, hi, ma'am, I'm calling you from the hotel that your husband stayed at last night. So, ma'am, I'm calling because, I'm calling because, and then he stopped. And he couldn't get himself kind of on track. He said, ma'am, I'm calling because, gosh, I've never done this before. So, ma'am, so here's the situation. I need to start over here. So, ma'am, I'm calling because there's been an incident. So, ma'am, and finally it went on. She said she had no idea what was going on here. And finally he spit it out. And he said, ma'am, I'm calling because there's been a terrible accident. Ma'am, your husband is dead. Said our cleaning crew, our housekeeping crew went through his room today. He was still in bed, unconscious. We called an ambulance. They raced over. The ambulance got there and pronounced him dead. Said he had been dead sometime in the night. My manager is now dealing with the situation. I've been asked to call you and give you the hospital morgue that we're sending your husband's body to. She said when he was saying this, when he finally spit it out, it didn't make any sense. Like, she couldn't make it make sense. And then when it did, she said her first visceral experience was the color being sucked out of the room. She looked into the living room and she had a preschooler and a toddler. And the first thing that went into her head was, my life is over. My life is over. She took out a little business card. She wrote on the back of it the hospital morgue address. She hung up the phone, called her mother to stay with her kids, and booked a flight. She said, I knew no one in Chicago. The plan was I was going to fly to Chicago. I was going to identify the body. I was going to sign the paperwork I needed to. We were going to have the body put on a plane, and I was going to fly home. I knew no one. She said, I got on that flight. The flight lasted 3 minutes. It lasted 3 days. She said, I was so drowning in grief, I didn't even feel like I was in time. She gets to O'Hare. She goes down to the cab stand. She hands the cabbie the card, and he drives. She said, I should have noticed this, but I was drowning in grief. I didn't notice anything. I should have noticed that he parked the car. She said, I walked in, and the people at the hospital morgue had my itinerary. They knew when I was going to be there, and they immediately took me to a side room. She said, I stood there for about a minute and a half. It felt like a day, but it was about a minute and a half, because I knew this was it. This was the moment. This was the moment when my nightmares would be so real. And she said she stood there, doors opened on the other side of the room, a gurney came in, and there was a body under a sheet. The man from the hospital morgue grabbed the sheet to pull it back so she could identify the body. And just as he started to do that, she said, I felt a hand on my shoulder, and an arm came around the front with a water bottle. And she started to cry, and she said to me, it was the cabbie. It was the cabbie. She said, I never felt more ministered to. She said, I got back on that plane. She said, I was not sure how I was going to put my life back together, but I knew God had not abandoned me, that Jesus Christ would see me through. And then she said to me again, I've never told anyone that story. How long can the world go on under such a subtle God? This God of Israel, this God of Jesus Christ, is moving, ministering life out of death, coming near and taking what is broken. And yet we're worried about market share loss. Yet we're worried about participation. And yet God is taking what is dead and making it alive. And then there's this cabbie. I know nothing about this cabbie. She knows nothing about the cabbie. That's where her story ended, and we held this holy moment together. But this cabbie, just to be completely fictional about this cabbie needs a community. He needs to stumble into your church on a Tuesday night or a Wednesday night and say, I got to tell you all what happened to me. I don't know what to make of this. I'd been working all night. This is going to be my last run. And this woman came to my cab. And I looked at the dress, and I caught her eye, and I knew she was sad. There was something deep in there. And then I saw that address again, and I knew that place. Because when my cousin Ronnie had his heart attack at work, that's where he took his body. And I remember my auntie throwing herself on my cousin's body. Said I got her to the hospital morgue, and I heard it. I don't know what to make of it. It must have been the Holy Spirit. I heard it. I heard it clearly. I heard God say, don't leave her alone. Whatever you do, do not leave her alone. But I didn't know what to do. So all I could do is put my hand on her shoulder and give her a water bottle. What that cabbie needs is a community. What that cabbie needs is a pastor that says, behold, you have been a servant of the Lord. God has moved. This God always moves from underneath. This God is always hidden, but this God always comes near to care for the brokenhearted, to bring life out of death. And I think ultimately your job is to witness to that, to point to that. This God is not subtle. This God is bringing life out of death. Let me pray for us. God, here we are. In fear and in trembling, we ask you to send us. Bless these people, God, and lead us. Amen.